On January 28th, 1864. January 28th, 1864, Frederick Douglass came to New Haven. And he gave two speeches here. One, I think I mentioned this before, was out at Grapevine Point, where the 29th Connecticut Black Regiment was training in the depth of January. Almost 1,000 strong when they started. This is in the book. But he also gave a speech right downtown here on Crown Street, one block over, in what was then known as the Music Hall. Later became the New Haven Opera House. It's no longer there. Right over there, where the students all go, to the clubs. Or maybe you do too, I don't know. He gave a variation of a speech he'd been given on the road since at least December 63, called The Mission of the War. That's one of his 5 greatest speeches, in my humble opinion. I'll put it up on the canvas. There are electronic versions of it now. I can't be certain exactly how much of it he delivered. It's a long speech. But I know what's in it. He made a big point in that speech about the problem of black soldiers not getting equal pay, the denial of commissions as officers, although that was beginning slowly to change. The posters that advertised the speech said, "Fred Douglass tonight." Sort of one of those one-time only posters. He hated being called Fred, by the way. There are examples of him going up to people and saying, "Madam, that will be Frederick to you." But he didn't complain that I know of that night. He made a big argument in that speech, and to a turn-away audience, standing room only. I don't know how many people the music hall could fit. I probably should have figured that out. I don't know how many Yale students went, but a block away they should have. I don't know how many Yale faculty went. They should have. He made a big argument in that speech for what he called the national regeneration of America. The mission of the war, the meaning of the war, the purpose of the war. Now that emancipation was its purpose, it seemed, was national regeneration. They were remaking America. They were remaking a country. They were redefining the republic in blood. He went on. He gave one of the clearest descriptions of the kind of apocalyptic, purposeful collision in history that he had come to believe the war was, and so did so many other people, including Lincoln to a degree. He said, quote, "Providence," and we've talked about that word before, by which one could mean God, nature, fate, history. He said, "Providence had," quote, "entered human affairs and turned history in a new direction." Now, believe that or not, that's what he said. And he said the results of the war would usher, I'm quoting, "from human choices, but that they would be either national salvation or national ruin." One or the other. We've been hearing a lot of that rhetoric ourselves of late. As I said a few weeks ago, we have to keep hoping this election we're about to have is not 1860. Although people are using that metaphor all over the place now. He said the war is a, quote, "potent teacher." Yeah. Events as teachers. And then he said, write this one down if you can. You can't, but He said, the most hopeful fact of the hour is that we are now in a salutary school, the school of affliction. If sharpened signal retribution, long protracted and wide-sweeping and overwhelming, can teach a great nation respect for the long-despised claims of justice, surely we shall be taught now and for all time to come. A school of affliction. It's a very biblical phrase. It's all over the Bible in many ways. God entering history, tearing up the land, punishing the people, ripping it apart and remaking it. And he said, the lessons of this school of affliction shall now be, quote, written in characters of blood. Douglass could be a very bloodthirsty war propagandist in this war, in case you didn't know that. It was a very partisan speech, obviously. He's arguing for the side he'd just recruited two of his sons into. He went on to the end where he said, what we now want is a country, a free country, a country nowhere saddened by the footprints of a single slave, and nowhere cursed by the presence of a single slaveholder. We want a country which shall not be cursed by the presence of a slaveholder. We want a country which shall not brand the Declaration of Independence a lie. Pretty direct, pretty apocalyptic. And then he even borrowed from language we don't like. He half apologized. He said, quote, I do not go to all the lengths to which such theories are pressed. Then he said, but it is the manifest destiny of this war to unify and organize the institutions of this country, and that herein is the secret of the strength, of the fortitude, the persistent energy, in a word, the sacred significance of this war. Manifest destiny, he said, that the Union has to win this war and remake the country. He knew his audience. Mission of the War speech is worth reading, if for no other reason than it is as great an expression of Union victory in the interest of emancipation as anyone ever delivered. Lincoln in his second inaugural, well, I don't think he drew directly on that speech. I don't believe that. I wouldn't claim that, but it's the same idea. When you read Lincoln's second inaugural, March 1865, check it out, same argument. Also in 1864, that spring, April 12, 1864, a former slave named George Hatton, who was now a sergeant, non-commissioned, Company C, 1st Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, was encamped near New Bern, North Carolina, on the coast. He sat down to write a letter and reflect upon the circumstance he found himself. It was an extraordinary circumstance that he begins to describe. This is one of those documents we have about emancipation, one of the thousands of documents, the voices of freed people. Hatton and his fellow soldiers and their families had lived generations in slavery. And he's now got a blue uniform on, a musket, and to some degree the command of other men who are also black. He struggled to find the right words for his sentiments. I quote him. Though the government openly declared that it did not want Negroes in this conflict, I look around me and see hundreds of colored men armed and ready to defend the government at any moment. And such are my feelings that I can only say, the fetters have fallen, our bondage is over. Now that's confidence. It's only April '64. A month later, Hatton doesn't stop. His letters are amazing. His regiment was now encamped in Jamestown, Virginia, and he appears to have understood the symbolism of Jamestown. Several black freed women entered their lines, showing evidence that they had recently been severely whipped by a slave master. Members of Hatton's company managed to capture, and they named who he was. They managed to capture a Mr. Clayton, the man who had done the beatings. The white Virginian was stripped to the waist, tied to a tree, and given 20 lashes by one of his former slaves named William Harris, now a member of the Union Army. In turn, each of the women Clayton had beaten were given the lash and allowed to lay it on his back. Don't cheer. This almost never happened. The women were given leave, in Sergeant Hatton's words, quote, to remind him that they were no longer his, but safely housed in Abraham's bosom. And under the protection of the Star-Spangled Banner, these are Hatton's words, and guarded by their own patriotic, though once downtrodden race. And again, Hatton says he felt lost for words, but he wasn't. Oh, that I had the tongue, he said, to express my feelings while standing on the banks of the James River on the soil of Virginia, the mother state of slavery, as a witness to such a reverse. The day is clear. The fields of grain are beautiful, and the birds are singing sweet melodious songs, while poor Mr. Clayton is crying to his servants for mercy. The American Emancipation is the most documented in world history, in great part because it happened during wartime. And nobody keeps records like armies and navies. Hatton's letters are in the National Archives, in the Army's collection of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of correspondences and dispatches from the front, and many of them from black civilians and women. Back up a year. January 1st, 1863, on the outline it says Tremont Temple. Tremont Temple is today it's a beautiful church. Then it was a mostly secular hall in downtown Boston. Maybe some of you have been there. Gorgeous place. Had to be rebuilt in the late 19th century because it had a bad fire. But on Emancipation night, January 1st, 1863, Frederick Douglass was among a whole large crowd. They packed the place, waiting for the news. Would it come, though, was still the question. They gathered in the morning. They waited all day. The story, of course, is it was New Year's Day and Lincoln held a big reception at the White House and shook hands all day and couldn't even go upstairs to sign this document until evening. They kept runners going up and down Tremont Street to the telegraph office, which was a couple blocks. Afternoon came, nothing's happening. A little bit of worry sets in. Late afternoon comes, quite a bit of worry sets in. Around early evening, the crowd is getting very, very distressed. Douglass kept trying, and others with him, kept trying to get control of the audience, and they were singing, they were making speeches, waiting for the news. This was a Jubilee meeting, or what in lore would be called forever, Jubilee meetings. Jubilee being a word from the Bible, mostly Old Testament, meaning freedom. but in most biblical uses it is liberation of workers, laborers, slaves. Jubilee meetings. And this night at Tremont Temple was the greatest, watch night that black folk had ever had. Whole lot of abolitionists were at this. William Lloyd Garrison was across town at a different celebration. He and Douglass still didn't take the same stage. They had had a falling out. Finally, at about 9 p.m., with the crowd very distressed, a runner came in the side of Tremont and said, "It's coming! It's on the wires." Well, what was it? Turns out, it was the Emancipation Proclamation. And it got telegraphed out across the country. And this guy had a dispatch. I don't know if he had the whole text yet, but he had the whole beginning of it. And he stood before the crowd and he started to read it. The Bill of Lading. They didn't care what the words were. They couldn't have cared less what was in it. All they wanted to know is the dude that signed it. They didn't know what it said. And it didn't matter. Douglass and the place erupted. 3,000-4,000 people fit into Tremont Temple, erupted, shouting, joy. They're jumping on chairs and up on there's a very large altar stage at Tremont. Douglass finally got control of the audience for a while, and he led them in song, one of his favorites, the one entitled "Blow Ye the Trumpet Blow." Sound the loud timbrel over Egypt's dark sea. Jehovah has triumphed. His people are free. And this crowd knew the song. How many songs can you start these days where everybody knows it? I know if it's Beyonce and if it's Taylor Swift and I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak amiss. So sorry. The place was in jubilation. But they'd only rented the place until midnight. And the party went on for a couple of hours, and the police showed up and said, "You got to leave. Permit. You're out at midnight." So they weren't ready to stop partying, so they went across Boston Common over to Beacon Hill to an old black church. It was known as Reverend Grimes's church. That particular church is no longer there. But they went to that church and partied all night. And Douglass walked out the next morning in snow flurries and went back to Rochester, where he had already written, before he ever left, before going to Boston, he'd already written this 3 or 4 days before January 1st. It's a little editorial he prepared, called A Day for Poetry and Song. Later on, in his third autobiography, he summed up the meaning of that night, and he really caught it. He said it was not logic, but the trump of jubilee, which everybody wanted to hear. In other words, whatever the words were, so be it. The word freedom's in it, and we're going to celebrate. We were waiting, he said, and listening for a bolt from the sky which would rend the fetters of 4 millions of slaves. We were watching, as it were, by the dim light of stars for the dawn of a new day. We were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries, remembering those in bonds as bound with them. That's a biblical line. We wanted to join in the shout for freedom and in the anthem of the redeemed. That's the cruel and apocalyptic war, put into language as nobody else could. All right. But what's now is going to happen on the ground? Out in the South, all across the country. What's that process of emancipation really going to be? I'll come back to Wallace Turnage in a minute, or a couple minutes. But bear with me for just a few minutes, because that process of emancipation was by no means simple. I like this photo because it's wartime and he just looks angry. School of Affliction? I think he's got it. And before we leave it, I messed up the other day and didn't show you this photo. This is Matthew Brady's just amazing photograph of when Abraham Lincoln went out to George McClellan's encampment very close to Antietam battlefield in early October, about 2 weeks after the battle, 2.5, 3 weeks, and fired McClellan. Now, that's what makes this photograph so amazing, because that's all of McClellan's staff. I don't know who Lincoln had with him, but here's the tall president, and there's another photo. Inside that tent, we have a photo of the two of them sitting across from the table, and this is where McClellan exited the war. Now, look at this with me just for a minute. There's a little blurriness in that. I'm sorry. That's all my fault. But I think you get the sense here. The purple part is 1861. This is the penetration of Union troops into the South. Emancipation is going to have, to some degree, everything to do with where the armies are. Well, not quite everything. There are four main factors about where, when, how, if an American slave became free in this war. The second blue is 1862, if you can see the legend here. I think you can. That's a lot of the Upper South. This is how far. You'll note by the end of 1862, half of Tennessee is in Union hands. Well, a little more than half, 2/3. Because of the capture of the forts along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers and all the way down to Shiloh, which is just east of Memphis. That side of Corinth, I want you to notice, Corinth and Mobile. I'm pointing to something you can't see me point, I'm sorry. But can you see Corinth up in the northeast corner of Mississippi? And Mobile, of course, is down on the Gulf. There was a railroad called the Mobile and Chicago, the Mobile and Northern, I forget exact, but it runs right from Mobile up through Corinth and on up to Chicago. I'll introduce you in a minute, for 2 minutes, to a guy named Wallace Turnage, who will escape from slavery in Mobile Bay after 4 other attempts on land to make it to Corinth, Mississippi, when he was 16 and 17 years old, because in Corinth was a garrison town controlled by the Union forces after 62. It's through 63, 64. And Wallace Turnage, it's a miracle he wasn't killed. But he will try 4 times to get to Corinth, and every time he gets captured. He also wanted to get to Corinth because it had a contraband camp, meaning a slave refugee camp. He knew these things from the grapevine. More on Wallace in a second. The green part is 1863. You can see the increased penetration by Union forces of this massive war front. Don't forget again, one of the South's greatest advantages in this war was its geography. It is such a vast territory. And by 62, 63, it has to be conquered. The only way the Union can win this war is to conquer the South. And that's increasingly clear after 62. It's increasingly clear in 63. I'll come back to the war next Tuesday and then try to wrap up the war and get on with Reconstruction. But the territory is vast. And it's why this war took such massive mobilization in order to win or lose. By 64, you got the orange parts. And look how important that is now. It's most of Northern Virginia, including surrounding Richmond. And this will include, and we'll deal with this next week, this now includes Atlanta to the sea. The great campaign led by, the horrible campaign led by William Tecumseh Sherman in 1864. And that swath across the South, from Vicksburg all the way across northern Alabama. Sherman had a lot to do with that too. But where the war went had a great deal to do with where emancipation happened. 4 big factors. The character of the slave society where people lived. Was it Virginia, for example, where so much of the war is fought, which didn't have large, scale plantations, but it had the largest slave population. It had a tremendous amount of small farms with slaves, smaller farms. It had what we would call lots of truck farming and hiring out of slaves. And a lot of those people had a good deal of experience in 62, 63, and 64 with being hired out to the iron works of Richmond and hired out to the Confederate armies. If you encountered a Confederate army in this war, you would see hundreds, if not thousands, of black people who were working in the army for nothing. If it's Kentucky, where a lot of the war gets fought, and Tennessee, or other border states, a lot of small-scale farming, but lots of slaves. The lower Mississippi Valley, and then the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, densely populated with enslaved people. Those people had more autonomy in some ways. They sometimes rarely saw white people. And when their owners had to flee, and evacuate, sometimes they fled with them, but often they stayed behind. In other words, where the armies go has a lot to do with how people became free. The degree to which enslaved people were mobilized as military laborers, frankly by both sides, the degree to which masters decided to force their slaves to go with them, they called it refugeeing them. They made that a verb. And there was a great deal of confusion and flux in this process. You can only imagine. Again, emancipation was no day of jubilee. It was days and days and days and days and days, bloody days, terrifying days. Do you run? Do you go? Where do you go? Who do you trust? Do you trust anybody in a blue uniform? Maybe. Do you trust your master? Because he's still got food. Second big factor was, this is obvious, I suppose, it's the course of the war. If the war moves deeper into the lower Mississippi Valley, there are going to be a lot more slaves free because it's a very densely populated slave region. If it's going to move into the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, incredibly dense slave populations. And if the amphibious landings by Union forces there are successful, there's going to be a lot of emancipation. Third, this is very important, it's how Wallace Turnage becomes free. It's the policies being enforced by either side. The policies being enforced by either the Union government through its army or the Confederate government through its army. Are ex-slaves going to only be military laborers, or are they going to be considered contraband of war, property seized of the enemy? The answer to both of those is yes at different times. Or are they going to be freed by the executive edict called the Emancipation Proclamation and the order within it it's worth remembering here. There are two things that are really different between the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 22 of 62, remember the 100 days until the final proclamation. That preliminary proclamation, it makes a very legalistic case for the president having the power to do this. And by the way, in that preliminary proclamation, Lincoln does it with Seward, his Secretary of State. Both of them will sign it. There's a handmade copy of that rests today in the New York State Library in Albany because it had been owned by Nelson Rockefeller. But I got to see it. So a lot of people have. They have it on a roller. They'll bring it out for you. But the coolest thing about it, I should have brought a picture of that, but the coolest thing about it is Lincoln wanted to use all the precedent he could come up with. This guy's a lawyer. He's kind of find all the precedent he can here because he doesn't know if this is going to hold up in courts. He doesn't trust, Roger Taney. He doesn't know what to trust here. And it's all going to depend on the Union forces winning. So what does he do? He cuts out 2 paragraphs from the Second Confiscation Act, which authorized the Army to liberate slaves, and pasted it on. It's one of the most moving documents I've ever seen. The dude got out some paste and scissors. And you can see it right there. You can see where they pasted it. I'm sorry, that's a cool document to historians. And the fourth factor, big factor, is of course the ingenuity, the volition, the initiative, the bravery of former slaves themselves. When to run, how, to where. And there are going to be about 20 to 25 so-called contraband camps. The correct term for them has become in recent times refugee camps. And there are several really good books. My favorite, and I think the best book on it, is by Amy Morrell Taylor, if you're interested. Really good book. She won the Frederick Douglass Prize for this. Embattled Freedom, Journeys Through the Civil War's Slave Refugee Camps. We no longer put the word contraband in titles. It's all right. It sort of eliminates now all those poems and all those songs written about contrabands. You can't use them anymore. Unless you want to be really incorrect, but I'm not going to do that today. And don't forget Charlie Brewster, my guy from Massachusetts, whose letters I did. He took a slave refugee. Did I already tell you this? His name was David. He was about 16 years old. Charlie's about 27, 28. This kid escaped out of Northern Virginia into the lines of the 10th Massachusetts in the winter of 1861-62, and the policy being enforced by the Union government at that point was absolutely not yet clear at all. But Charlie decided, that kid's brave enough to run away and come up here. I'm going to take him in. Besides, I need a servant. Charlie always had mixed motives. He took him into camp, and Charlie became an officer. So this David became his personal servant. And he writes home to his sister saying, you know those stocking caps you make for me? Make one for David. You know those warm winter wool pantaloons or whatever they were? Make one for my contraband. Somewhere in February, I think it was, or early March of 62, the orders came down from General Halleck, General of the Army, and orders through the colonel of his regiment that no runaway slaves shall be taken into our lines unless their owners are loyal to the Union. Now, how in the devil Union soldiers and officers and so on were supposed to figure that out, no one ever was clear on. But for legal reasons, the policy of the Union Army at that first year of the war, which was soon to change because of the Emancipation Proclamation, the policy was called denial of asylum, legally, meaning if they escape to your lines and they come from a Confederate owner, you have to send them back. If they have a loyal owner, and you can somehow find that loyal owner, you can keep him, free him. It was impossible. It was totally confusing. Turns out Charlie's David had a Confederate owner, which is what most slave owners in Virginia were, and the day came when he was supposed to turn him over to his owner. That owner came to the Union camp. And what did Charlie do? You know, he had mixed motives, but he took his David, his buddy, so-called, out into the woods and said, "Get out of here, run." He would not turn him back to his owner. That was the beginning of Charles Brewster becoming his own kind of abolitionist. But he was bucking up against the policy of his own government, his own army, at that point. All right. Now, a few other thoughts here about black soldiers. I mean, I know here we go. You know, once black soldiers were, well, I'm sorry, I forgot to complete that thought. Forgive me. In the final Emancipation Proclamation, which is very similar language to the preliminary with some changes, there are two distinct differences, and they're very important. Because in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had said that they still were looking for ways of engaging in colonization of black folk voluntarily willing to leave the country. If colonization could still be engineered by the federal government, emancipation would be followed by colonization. Now, it was left pretty vague, but there it was. And that's why a whole lot of black folk, like Douglass and others, weren't sure what to trust here. Is this going to be a colonizationist emancipation, as Douglass put it, or real freedom? And by the way, Lincoln appointed Montgomery Blair, a Republican from Missouri, but from a former slaveholding family, to be the czar of colonization. If the federal government was going to design colonization schemes, and they had one going off the coast of Haiti on an island, and they had one going in Central America, Nicaragua, a place called Cherokee, or at least they tried to get one going. Yes, in part this was about Northern public opinion, but there was still enough belief in the Republican Party, and even Abe Lincoln himself for a while, that this could be a partial result, at least, if not a full result, of emancipation. He puts Montgomery Blair in charge. Blair wrote to Frederick Douglass, most famous black man in the country, and tried to recruit Douglass to be the czar of colonization. And I urge you, if you ever read a biography of Douglass, look up Douglass's response. Nothing animated Douglass like the invitation to be the Lincoln administration's czar of colonization. He told them where they could put their offer for him to be the head of colonization over and over. He says, "You are denying our birthright. You are denying the very meaning of this war. You are denying the purpose of America." And he said, "No, thank you." As did almost all other black leaders. Now, black folk were forced into labor by the Confederate forces, I've said this already, across the South. We get a lot of images like this from the Union side. This kid's name was Jackson. That's all we know about him. he's a slave in rags. Of course, photographers love this stuff. He's a slave in rags one day, and he's a drummer boy the next. In the spring of '63, March, I think is the actual date, March something, might have been April, when serious recruiting of black soldiers begins, because the Emancipation Proclamation had said there will be no, well, at least it had no mention of colonization any longer. And Lincoln, at least, and most in his administration, gave up on this idea of colonization. But the second thing that the Emancipation Proclamation called for was the enlistment of black soldiers. It's one fairly quiet sentence at the very end of it. Read it. But it is arguably the most revolutionary aspect of the Civil War, putting almost 200,000 black men in Union blue with muskets on their shoulders and cartridge boxes on their belts and training them to shoot and march and kill. Pretty revolutionary. There were a lot of people who, even when they saw a black regiment, said, oh my God, they got guns. In the South, they weren't giving guns to anybody until the very end of the war. And that's what, in the outline, I called Confederate Emancipation. I'll come back to that in a second. But this was a broadside, a poster. Frederick Douglass wrote every word of this. It was spread across the North. They even made gigantic versions of it that hung over streets in Philadelphia and New York and other northern towns. At the Library Company in Philadelphia, a major archive, they have one of those original huge, these things are like 10 feet high. They hung them on wires across the street. They can't display it because it's too big. They took me up to the archive. They said, you want to see this? I said, yeah. And I saw it. I mean, it literally covers the whole wall. Men of colored arms, now or never, 3 years service, and the writing gets less. Battles of liberty and union, fail now and our race is doomed. Silence the tongue and calumny, valor and heroism, on and on and on it goes. And then it starts naming battles that black men have been in already by the summer of '63. It's an amazing document, whether you had the small version, and they mass-produced these by the thousands. And they came. I love this photo. Just try to look at those faces. I mean, here we got a guy on the far left who's looking pretty determined. Guy in the back, sort of maybe amused. Look at me, saying, check me out. Look at the tilt of my cap. And then the guy on the right, he's practically smiling. And in a 19th century photograph, that's not easy because you had to stand there for a while. But boy, was there pride. And each one of them's an individual human being. I have, here's a name. Here are two members of the famous 54th Massachusetts that nobody knows. This guy's name was Private Abraham Brown. And this guy was Private Harry Stewart. Actually, no, Staff Sergeant Harry Stewart. He's got the stripes. And that is Lewis H. Douglass, Frederick Douglass's oldest son, who became Staff Sergeant, was very badly wounded at the Battle of Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor. Nearly died of gangrene. He was wounded in the groin, as they would say. He could never have children. He survived through a good deal of time in a New York soldiers' hospital. Now, to this business of what the Confederates were doing. I've said already, Blacks were put in forced labor in the South throughout the war. I mean, Georgia's a fascinating example. I mentioned Virginia, but Georgia's an amazing example, and there's a great book on it. And by the way, in the study of emancipation, back when the documents of emancipation started coming out in volume after volume, which is where we get George Hatton and many other people, scholars started writing books on emancipation in Louisiana, emancipation in Virginia, emancipation in Georgia. Clarence Moore wrote this amazing book on Georgia. He showed from detailed evidence that more than 10,000 slaves, soon to be former slaves, worked on Confederate defenses, especially around Atlanta. Who built all those defenses? Slaves. He found that about 80% of all the people, women, working in Confederate hospitals across Georgia once the war came there in 63, 64, were black women. Workers on railroad crews, largely black men. It gave many of them a chance to run away when they chose to. There were simply thousands of black workers around the Confederate armies. This guy, Patrick Cleburne, an Irish-born Confederate general stationed out in Tennessee in late 63, December 63 to be exact, was so worried about the course of the war that he wrote a famous memo to Jefferson Davis, the president, and said, I know you don't want to hear this, but we're going to have to start enlisting our slaves in the army. And Davis dismissed it. Cleburne was told, in effect, to shut up. But very soon this got out in early 64. And it sort of got some traction in the Confederate press. And eventually there is a rowdy, much bigger debate over this in the Confederacy than I ever realized until an amazing book by Bruce Levine called Confederate Emancipation. They got so worried that they were losing, and yet they have this massive manpower. Let's train some of them. Let's put muskets in their hands. But in the press debate, oh my God, people write into their newspapers and they say things like, I'm a true Southern patriot. Give up the Negro slave rather than myself? Never, he says. Another writes in and says, next page. A woman who wrote a famous diary, later famous diary, Catherine Edmonston, she said if they give up their property in slaves, they give up the very purpose of the war. And she's not wrong, of course. She said, this would, quote, destroy at one blow the highest jewel in our crown. If slavery is to be abolished, then I take no more interest in this fight, wrote another Confederate general. But the debate went back and forth. They started, hammering each other. Oh, you want me to keep giving my sons to die in this war, but you won't let your slaves die? Pretty soon, they're debating. But if we give them muskets and we ask them to go fight, we might have to free them. Oh dear. It's an amazing story. And it shows how desperate the Confederacy became, especially by early 1865. And it became, in effect, as Bruce Levine argues, a kind of revolution from above. Eventually, quietly at first, and then very openly, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee himself supported enlisting black men, former slaves, in the Confederate Army in early 65. We know there's only 2 or 3 months left in the war. They were hoping 100,000 slaves would turn the tide. And finally, the Confederate Congress passed slave enlistment in the first week of March, 1865. That's 5 weeks before Appomattox. A little late. In the House of Representatives, it passed by 40 to 37. In the Senate, by 9 to 8. And it allowed Davis to put in place what they called a voluntary plan. If slave masters, owners were willing to give their enslaved men to the Confederate Army, it would be, quote, as Davis put it, a free will offering. Didn't work. Now, I'm going to end with this. I don't have quite enough time, but I'll get his story in the air, and then we'll pick it up next time and move on. I did a book some years ago, this book. It's called Slave No More, about 2 slave narratives that were found by other people. I didn't discover them. They were brought to me by 2 institutions. One was the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the other was the Greenwich, Connecticut Historical Society, of all places. They owned the narrative of this man, Wallace Turnage. Wallace was born in Greene County, North Carolina. At age 15, he was sold by his owner, whose name was Turnage. I know who his father was. We don't know who his mother was. But she was white. He was sold to Richmond, a major slave trading center. And Wallace spends 1860 and early 61 at a slave jail in Richmond, Virginia. There were several big ones. And he was held there. He was even put to work preparing the slaves for the auction stage. It was his job. Until one day they said, kid, you're in the auction. The next thing he knew, he was purchased by an Alabama slaveholder from Pickensville, Alabama. Pickensville isn't on this map. This is a map of Mobile Bay. But here's what I want you to know as we leave today. Wallace Turnage will write a narrative about his experience after the war. I don't know precisely when he wrote it. I know the year that the other guy wrote his, John Washington. The book I did has 2 of these narratives in it. They are very rare. Narratives of emancipation written by former slaves after the war. Rare documents. They were landed in my lap. I wasn't even sure what I had at first until I started looking into it. Wallace, by the way, left 4 photographs, 1 book. It was a work of world history, and a few postcards, along with his narrative, which had been beautifully and lovingly preserved in a clamshell box by his daughter. And there's a long, interesting story how it ended up in Greenwich, Connecticut. But back to his real tale. Wallace was sold to Pickensville, Alabama. I mentioned earlier that he tried to escape over and over and over. He was a crazy kid. He took every risk he could take. He was beaten to a pulp over and over and over, according to his narrative. He got all the way within earshot of Corinth, Mississippi, twice. He was nearly burned to death in a fireplace by one slave catcher. He's constantly captured 4 times over, taken back to Pickensville. Finally, his owner said, I've had it with you, kid. He took him down to Mobile, which is just south. in the summer of 1864 and sold him. Sold him to a family that lived in downtown Mobile. Mobile was under siege. Mobile had a huge Confederate army and huge fortifications. Wallace had a turbulent time in Mobile for several months. One day he was out driving his master's carriage, to get groceries or something, and he crashed the carriage and broke it all to pieces. And his master went nuts on him. So Wallace ran away. Again. He ran right through the Confederate encampments. Now, the way he was able to do that, I think, is just because there would have been so many other young black men in that camp. He was light-skinned, but he was clearly black and a slave. He just went right through the camp. And he went into what's known as the Foul River Estuary, which is that entire 20-mile region west of Mobile Bay. If you've ever been to Alabama, Mobile Bay is a huge bay. When I was doing this book, I rented a ferry boat. Well, a little boat, little ferry boat, to take me all over the Foul River Estuary. I had to see it. And I saw alligators, snakes. I had no way in God's earth I'd ever get in that swamp. But somehow Wallace survived it for nearly 2 weeks. He made it all the way down to near the mouth of the harbor. He heard the Battle of Mobile Bay on August 25, 26. He didn't know what the date was. He didn't know entirely what was happening, but he heard this gigantic naval battle that was happening out in the bay as Admiral Farragut was taking Mobile, or taking the bay. And he held out at the mouth of the bay in a hideout that the Confederates used. They'd come out and hide out, or they'd come out and do a lookout by day, and he'd go up at night. And he was starving to death. And he found himself a rowboat. And the rowboat had a hole in it. Bad rowboat. But he said, hell with it. He was so desperate, so hungry, he took his rowboat out into Mobile Bay. And he was crazy by this time. And a Union gunboat found him. 8 sailors in the Union gunboat. Said, hey kid, jump in. Wallace was taken to Fort Gaines, which you can see at the very bottom here, on Dauphin Island, which is a beautiful barrier island. It gets hit by a hurricane every 10 years, and all the houses are blown away, and they rebuild them. He was taken to Fort Gaines, which is still there. He was put before a Union general named Granger, and the Union general gave him 2 choices. By the way, the first night of his liberation, those Union sailors took him to a little tent and wrapped him in blankets and gave him something to eat. Next day, they took him to General Granger. General Granger wanted intelligence about Mobile because they're moving on Mobile. And he wanted everything the kid knew about Mobile. He was suddenly important. And he gave him 2 choices. He could join a black regiment, which they were forming all around that region, or he could become a servant to a white officer in the Union Army. And given what he'd been through, he said, I can cook. I'll be a servant. He served out the war as a cook for a guy in a Maryland Union regiment. As far as we know, he was finally, well, he wasn't never in the Army, but he was mustered out with that regiment in Baltimore in 1865. He lived out his life in New York City. He actually found his mother. Never could figure out quite how. He found her. He got married. He had kids. City directors told me all kinds of jobs he did. Very deep, working class, struggling sort of guy. He eventually moved across the Hudson River to Elizabeth, New Jersey, because it got a little dangerous in lower Manhattan. He didn't live on a good street. and they had epidemics. He joined the Abyssinian Baptist Church. He rode a ferry boat in to work in Lower Manhattan every day, right by the Statue of Liberty. And he didn't die until 1915. And he's buried in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn. But somewhere in those years after the war, he wrote this narrative about his freedom. The only story he told was from when he was sold in Richmond to when he escaped in Mobile Bay and went to Fort Gaines. It was as if he thought he had no other story to tell. We had to find the rest of his life, and things are findable. He lived out a life. He was a committee member in his church. At one point he was labeled in the city directory. I said, occupation, general jobber. I didn't even know what that meant. I went to friends who told me that meant he did any odd job he could get. But he left that narrative to his daughter. And that daughter lived to very old age. And she had a neighbor she gave that box to. That neighbor lived to an old age. And one day was watching a TV documentary called Unchained Memories about the WPA narratives and the former slaves being interviewed. And she watched that documentary, and the next day she called up the head of the Greenwich Historical Society and said, I may have something that would interest you, because I think I have one of those things. And that's how they got it. But, you know, what did freedom mean? To Wallace Turnage and thousands of others like him, it meant a chance, it meant dignity, it meant possible family, it meant possible security, it meant finding your mother, it meant wages, it meant citizenship, voting. This is John Washington's story. Last point. I'll tell you about John next week, but John's my other man. He escaped in Virginia along the Rappahannock River. His is, if anything, even more dramatic. He's going to live out his life in Washington, D.C. Big church man, big family. Oh, he became a house painter. But he had a son who did pretty well, moved up to Massachusetts, lived in Cohasset, Massachusetts, which is a South Shore, fancy suburb of Boston along the coast. And he died in Cohasset in 1918. And I found the house they lived in. It's a pretty nice house. I went there to give a talk one day about the book. I showed this picture. A man walked up to me afterward, and he and his wife said, we own the house that the Washingtons lived in. I own that cane. I said, how much you want for it? He wouldn't sell it. That's it for now.